Norwich Confidential with your hosts, Dr. Ben Hong, Bonnie Hong, and Mr. Bob Farwell. Good evening and welcome to Norwich Confidential. I'm Bonnie Hong, and I'm afraid I'm your only live host this evening, but we have an incredible guest. And actually, if you saw our last week's show, you'll remember we were talking about the natural gas pipeline coming through Connecticut, with the branch coming directly through Norwich, the pipeline extending all the way up to the port in Maine so that we can get the fracked gas from Pennsylvania to Maine for exporting. We're going to be putting in, I believe, 16-inch methane pipes through the state. Currently, there is a fracking moratorium in Connecticut, but because the pipeline will be going through here, there may be a need for fracking waste to have Connecticut take some of the fracking waste. So our guest this week is Attorney Shannon Laun, and she is the staff attorney at the Energy and she's actually the Energy and Environmental Attorney for ConnecticutEnvironment.org.
Connecticut Fund for the Environment.
And the Connecticut Fund for the Environment. It's kind of underneath the Connecticut Environment Organization, right?
No, that's actually not correct.
Oh, okay.
We're a separate organization. So
Completely?
We're Connecticut Fund for the Environment, although I know the State Director of Environment Connecticut quite well, and we've worked together on a number of initiatives.
Okay. And Attorney Laun was appointed as the staff attorney that she works with the Connecticut Legislature on all of these critical issues that really are affecting our everyday life. So she was appointed in October of last year, I believe, right?
That's correct.
Prior to that, she worked as a public interest law fellow at the Environmental Law Institute and the Climate and Air Legal Fellow at the Environmental Defense Fund. She holds a BA from the University of California, UCLA, and she received her law degree from Harvard Law School. She's also done a lot of citizen advocate work while she was at Harvard, I believe, right?
That's correct.
The Appalachian Citizens Law Center in Kentucky, the U.S. EPA, Office of the General Counsel in Washington, the Office of Regional Counsel in Boston, and we'll get to Boston's kind of incredible prevention for climate change, and the International Human Rights Clinic and the New York City Law Department Environmental Division. So you already have a pretty impressive resume.
Well, thank you.
I don't know if since we talked about the natural gas pipeline last week, do you want to kind of talk about the fracking issue in Connecticut at all, or shall I kind of talk about some of the issues that are in this Connecticut legislature first? Do you have a preference as to where I start asking you questions?
Well, I'm not entirely qualified to speak a great deal about the fracking issue because
Okay.
I've only heard about it. That actually happened before I joined CFE and before I lived in the state, so I'm not extremely knowledgeable about it.
Okay.
I'm happy to offer my thoughts on the issue in brief.
Okay.
So maybe we could start with that and then maybe
Sure.
move on to some of the energy and climate issues before the legislature.
Okay. So we know that these are 16-inch methane pipes that will be coming through. Connecticut does have a moratorium on fracking waste at this point, right?
Right.
It's only a 3-year moratorium. Probably just enough time to get the pipeline in and start the methane to flow. So do you see a time when we could actually be mandated to take some of the fracking waste?
So I think those are two distinct issues. One is the pipeline for natural gas, and that's using it as a fuel source. And then the fracking waste wouldn't be transported through the pipelines, is my understanding. I think
Right.
it's on
Correct.
trucks or some other means of transport. And so they're distinct issues. As far as being required to take the fracking waste, I'm not aware of any authority under which that could happen. I think more it would be an economic thing. If the moratorium was lifted and people found it profitable, then it could potentially happen. It's my own private opinion that we should extend that moratorium and not allow these dangerous wastes to be transported across the state when we're not really getting any benefit from it.
How much of the, you do a lot of work with the sound, with the New England Sound, working with New York, and in trying to clean up the dead zones that are in the Long Island Sound. There's a lot of statistics that you gather on the bacteria count all along the Connecticut shoreline. I noticed that you have on the website, there's a monthly, almost a monthly reading of the bacteria and the fecal waste. So there's a new office, I believe, that has opened up in the western part of the state.
In New York, that's right, and I'm glad you mentioned this. So we just launched a new tool. It's called the Sound Health Explorer. And what we did is we took data from all of the beaches along Long Island Sound, both in New York and in Connecticut, and compiled the data looking at days when they exceeded the water pollution standards. And a lot of that waste is coming from sewage plants. So it's, as you said, contamination from fecal matter, E. coli, and other bacteria that can make people seriously ill.
These are sewer lines in Connecticut?
In Connecticut and in New York.
Both places, okay.
That's right. Yeah, it's an old area of the country with a lot of kind of decaying infrastructure, and so it's been an ongoing problem that we're working to try and address, working with the municipalities and trying to inform people about the dangers of swimming in the water when it exceeds the water pollution standards. And we send out alerts on a weekly basis during the summer, letting people know if their beaches are safe to swim in.
Yeah, because it's really kind of frightening when you consider it's basically raw waste that you're swimming in.
That's true.
And it's disgusting.
One thing I should note is that it's especially bad after rain. That's when
the overflow?
Exactly, that's when overflow happens, and so a number of these beaches are almost always closed after a rainstorm, so that's something to be aware of.
Now, I saw one area where, so the erosion isn't happening, and you've got new native plants that are being planted along riverbanks and other things that try to help protect the water streams. Some of those kinds of independent, non-legislative solutions that the private sector is getting involved in, you know.
Yeah, that strategy in particular is known as green infrastructure, and it uses methods like you suggested, having more trees and plants planted along the riverbank, things like having a strip of soil and plants outside of parking lots so that when it rains, the wastewater, some of it will flow into there and then be filtered through the soil instead of just flowing down into the gutters.
That was also interesting. There's a material that I think I read about on your site, or one of the links to it, where it absorbs the water, so it goes down back into the soil. And that was amazing. I didn't even know something like that existed.
Yeah, there's a lot of incredible technologies that can be employed, and they actually can be a lot more effective than the traditional, what's known as gray infrastructure, which is the kind of hard solutions, having concrete and asphalt and directing things through conduits and pipes. Oftentimes that ends up being less effective because basically storm water, which is draining off of our city streets and picking up all kinds of pollutants and oil, that's all
salts
flowing into the sound. And so if you have these types of green infrastructure, it can get soaked into the ground, and there it's kind of filtered through, and you don't have those same types of pollution issues.
Yeah, I noticed even just rain barrels being employed. Very simple method of preventing, the mixing of this water.
Yeah, rain barrels and also rain gardens are both beautiful. And
what's a rain garden?
The idea is that you have your landscaping done in a way that it'll collect the water when it rains. And so I don't know a whole lot about it, but basically, for example, if your yard is tilted, then you would make sure to have adequate planting there so that the earth could absorb the water as it runs off instead of just flowing directly into the gutters.
Our guest 2 weeks ago was, again, we were talking about the natural foods, and they were talking about how landscapers are learning more and more about how to design exactly that. I wasn't familiar with it, and I didn't think they talked about an actual rain garden, but it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a very, that's
Yeah.
really pretty good. But now that
both beautiful and functional at the
Yeah.
same time.
The Connecticut Legislature came out, obviously, at the beginning of the session with their agenda. And on your site, there were a number of things that you are beginning to deal with this session of the General Legislature. One of the first was obviously climate change and energy. We kind of hit on the fact that we're getting this natural gas, methane, coming through Connecticut. So rather than expanding renewable energies, wind, solar, hydro, a number of others that would produce electricity, we're expanding natural gas.
Yeah, there is definitely an inconsistency there, and one thing I would like to note at the outset is that in EPA's Clean Power Plan, which just was released earlier this month, and for those who don't know, this plan sets emissions limits on fossil fuel-fired power plants across the country. In this big plan, which is getting a lot of media attention for good reason.
This is the
national plan. They
Economic
basically
Protection,
Environmental Protection Agency. They basically set targets for each state, and then the states have a lot of leeway as to how they meet those targets. But one really key thing that came out in this, which is kind of a shift from previous statements from the federal government, is now they are very strongly pushing the adoption of renewable sources of energy like solar and wind, as you mentioned, and others, and no longer pushing expansion of natural gas. So I think that basically shows the way forward, and is something that Connecticut should also start doing in really ramping up in-state renewables instead of focusing on increased natural gas generation. And it should also be noted that under the Clean Power Plan, states that increase the amount of renewables by 2022, I believe, will get extra credits under that plan. So it's a good incentive for Governor Malloy to go ahead and ramp this up, which he's already taking some steps to do, which I'm happy to talk about.
Okay, but before we go into what Malloy is going to hopefully do to ramp that up, the EPA may have put these new standards out, but Washington didn't come up with any money to back it. We don't have a lot of the increased tax incentives for the renewable energy sector, but we're still giving incentives and rebates and tax credits to the oil, to all the fossil fuels. Those were all passed. But we have a limited amount of the same kind of incentives for the renewable sector.
Yeah, and that's a tremendous problem. At one point, actually, it was a number of years ago, but I actually looked at the sum total of subsidies available to the coal industry, and they are quite large, and yet you don't tend to hear so much about that as you do hear about the relatively modest incentives that we have for renewables, which is really what we should be encouraging.
Reversed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the solar credit right now is still in force. It's going to be phased out, so the solar people are pushing very hard for an extension on that. I think right now with the Congress and the state that it's in, it's unlikely that that's going to happen, so people are expecting that there might be a bit of a dip in solar as that gets phased out, which I hope does not happen, but it's something that people are preparing for.
One of the ways that I noticed that people that are taking advantage of the fact that that solar credit won't be around is you have companies that are popping up that will install the solar for free, and then you'll just get your electric bill from them, but they own the solar panels, they own the energy source, so people that kind of think that they can actually produce their own electricity, which they could if we had some more of these credits, are actually just finding another corporation that keeps, because one or two of these companies are beginning to get larger and larger shares. So I just see another...
That's true, but I might push back just a little bit on that, in that there have actually been a number of kind of innovative financing models out there, and from what I've seen, there's a lot of good information for the consumer to make the decision that works best for them. So for some people, it might mean buying all the panels themselves, taking responsibility for their maintenance and upkeep and all of that. And for example, I have a coworker who did that, and he and his wife also have an electric vehicle, which I'd love to talk more about a little bit later, and they charge their electric vehicle from their solar panels, and that's great. And I've driven his car myself, and it was a lot of fun, especially thinking that it was powered from the sunlight.
Exactly.
But that's beyond the means of a lot of people, and so some of these alternative financing mechanisms, for example, you can lease the system, or there's also an agreement where it's called a power purchase agreement, where you're basically it's similar to a lease with some differences, where you're basically purchasing the power. And those can work well for some people as well. The contract terms are very clear. I would advise anyone who's interested in solar to read up on the various options and make sure that you are getting a good deal.
The state had a good opportunity, though, to provide one piece of legislature in the shared solar program.
Indeed, and that's something that I worked on this year with a pretty broad, loose coalition of clean energy advocates, environmental advocates, the solar installers, and unfortunately things didn't go quite as we planned.
Well, explain first to the audience what that whole program was like.
Yeah, so first I'll explain what shared solar is. Basically the idea is that it's a shared solar installation that can provide power to multiple people. And the reason that's necessary is that on average, about 20% of Connecticut residents can put solar panels on their homes.
Only
20%. And the reason for that is that, as people know, this is a very heavily forested state. A lot of people have roofs that are too shady to get solar, or would make it basically uneconomical. A lot of people live in apartment buildings. In New Haven, where I live, a very high percentage of the population are renters, and you are kind of stuck unless you can convince your landlord to put a solar installation on the roof. Then there's nothing you can do about it. And so about 80% of us cannot actually put solar panels on our roofs, whether because it's too shady, we rent, we live in an apartment, or for whatever reason. And so that basically means that a huge majority of the population can't access this clean power. And shared solar solves that problem by having a larger solar installation. You might have it on a brownfield, which is an old industrial site. It could be on a rooftop. Sometimes they're on farmland or fields or something like that. And customers in the immediate area can buy a share of that electricity and that way access solar power. And it's an excellent way to both ramp up renewables and also ensure that everybody, no matter what their living situation is, can access this clean power.
What a great idea.
That's exactly what we thought.
So what happened to the bill?
The bill faced some opposition from the utilities.
From all of them?
From United Illuminating and Eversource. We're not such a big fan of this idea. And one thing I should mention is that the state legislature actually was considering a bill on shared solar back in 2014, which is before I came to the state, but I heard about what happened. They were close to reaching a deal, and then it kind of fell apart in the last minute. And so everyone came back in 2015 and wanting to work on this. And at the end of the 2014 session, the legislature turned to the Connecticut Academy of Science and Engineering. CASE is the acronym for short. And they said, well, we think this is a good idea, but we'd like you to look more closely at it and let us know what a good model would look like, whether we should proceed with this. So I was one of the, what they called study contacts for that report, and we were invited to meetings. There were a whole room full of experts, people from the utilities, people from academia, people from the solar industry, and every month we heard presentations from around the country because this is being implemented in a lot of other states, including our neighbor to the north, Massachusetts, has a very successful shared solar program. They do. And so they put out this big report. It came out in March, and CASE concluded that shared solar was a great solution to increasing renewable power and allowing people to access it. And specifically, they advocated developing a full program without restrictions on the number of projects or the amount of megawatts, and not doing a pilot program because they said this has been tried and tested in a number of other states. It's been successful. We know enough that we can just go ahead and learn from what other states have done. And the utilities were not so convinced by that. Their business model is basically threatened by more people getting their power from solar and not directly from the utilities. And so they came in and said, we're concerned that maybe this will raise rates for people.
Yeah, why? Because their rates have gone up every single year. So.
Right, which many of us didn't find a very compelling argument based on the studies we've seen, including value of solar studies, which actually have shown that the benefits of solar, not just the environmental benefits, but things like increased security and resiliency, and reduced transmission line losses because people are consuming the power close to where it's produced, as opposed to a big power plant over here and it being transmitted however far to a city. So the benefits of solar actually far outweigh. But anyway, so the utilities were not a big fan of this idea, and they said, well, of course renewables are great. We should encourage this, but we should proceed slowly and cautiously. So they advocated for a pilot program, and ultimately that's what the legislature decided to do. So right now we have a pilot program, a total of 6 megawatts. Six.
Which will power what?
About 840 homes.
Really?
That's the average. Looking at numbers, some of the solar groups have done averages for about how much a megawatt will power in each state. So that's about how much it will be. I don't know how it will be for sure. But it's still, looking at that compared to the number of people in the state, it's still pretty small.
Right.
And it only allows a total of 2 megawatts in the United Illuminating service territory and a total of 4 megawatts in the Eversource service territory.
Where is Eversource?
Eversource covers most of the state. United Illuminating is significantly smaller. That's my utility actually in New Haven. So it covers New Haven and a couple of the surrounding towns.
What is the, Ben, maybe you could help me out. Do you remember the name of the co-op that Norwich Public Utilities is involved in?
Oh, they're not a producer of.
No, but I just wanted to know if...
They're a municipal utility,
right. But they have a co-op. There's like 5 cities that are actually involved in a co-op. I wasn't even aware of that. I thought that Norwich was pretty independent, that we weren't, being, and so I was a little surprised at that. But yes, we are a municipal.
I just happened to know that because I spoke with one of the division managers of Norwich Public Utilities recently, and he was telling me about the shared solar project that they have.
What is our shared
I don't
solar?
remember the details. He just mentioned it in passing, but I should note that the municipal utilities are separate from, they kind of operate separately from the 2 big regulated utilities. So I believe Norwich is one of the more progressive ones.
Yes.
So the municipal utilities can go ahead and do this on their own, but most of them are not. They're not subject to the same restrictions as the 2 big ones.
They don't need to abide by the this pilot program.
No, this is separate. This is just for the 2 big regulated utilities.
So if Norwich wanted to do this shared power, you said 6 kilowatts would, how many homes?
Megawatts.
I'm sorry, megawatts, 6 megawatts.
Yeah, the estimate is about 840 homes.
840 homes.
Yeah.
So they could even have one larger, continue to expand that
without
getting...
Most of the projects existing, for example, Massachusetts has been doing this for a few years now, and most of the shared solar projects are not huge. I think they're usually around like 1 or 2 megawatts usually. Right. And I'm not entirely sure the reason. I think that's because if it gets too big, it ends up taking up a whole lot of land. And while you might be able to do that out in the desert in
Right.
Arizona or California or Nevada, it's
Right.
not so feasible here.
Right.
So most of them are smaller and serving the immediate area, but
Right.
certainly
And-
it could be done.
And I do know that we are putting in a solar array that Public Utilities is doing. But I didn't realize that would have been part of what would have been considered shared solar. But I guess I understand that.
Yeah, there are different models. United Illuminating actually also has a large solar installation, and there are, across the country, there are some models where the utility is the one running it, and then people can buy into that specifically. Sometimes they just have it as part of their power supply where, like,
Right.
it
just
feeds
mixes
into
in.
Everything else, all the other
You've
sources
got the
as
coal
well.
along with the solar.
Right,
Yeah.
and then there are some private ones. Sometimes it's members of a community who get together. Sometimes it's private developers who come and do it. So there's a variety of models.
Those are very smart. I mean, if someone had even a big field that was no longer being farmed, perfect. What about wind in Connecticut? Do you know much about what our wind capacity is?
There's not huge wind capacity here because the coastline is entirely along Long Island Sound, and you really get much better wind off the open coastline.
Right.
So from what I've heard, there's not a lot of potential, but in addition to that, there would be really huge political resistance because it's such a heavily populated coastline. What happened up in Massachusetts, they had a project, or they still have a project called Cape Wind off of Cape Cod, and there were an unbelievable number of lawsuits filed against this project trying to stop it because residents said, we don't want any wind turbines out there. I can't even remember if they were, how visible they were or what really the impacts would have been, but people did not like the idea. Many people did not like the idea. And so they filed lawsuit after lawsuit trying to prevent this from happening and cause delay. It finally did go forward, but not after a lot of time and expenses. And people say that something similar would probably happen here. But there is a large wind farm in Maine that Connecticut helped and did a procurement contract for. And so it's not as ideal because it's out of state and it has to travel a ways to get to Connecticut, but it's still a good source of clean power that we're getting here.
I mean, I was excited when I saw that program for the clean solar. But going back, you mentioned the electric car, and again, there seems to be an incongruity between what is said and then the actions of the legislature. Because if they're saying we need more electric vehicles, we want to stop the emissions from, the gas and, and yet when Tesla comes into Connecticut, they have gone through committee hearings after committee hearings, and we were going to finally, hopefully, get a bill passed so they could have a showroom. And what happened with that bill?
So that was not a bill I was directly
I know,
working
that-
on, but
that
I
happened.
do know about it, and this is a fight that's been
Last
playing
year.
out all across the country because many states like Connecticut have laws that restrict selling automobiles from dealerships, and Tesla has a different business model. They have their own stores and sell directly to consumers, and that's a business threat to dealerships, and so they've been fighting to try and keep Tesla out, and that's what happened here. From what I've heard, they actually had reached an agreement. The Connecticut Auto Retailers Association and Tesla had basically made a compromise, and that was set to be passed into law, and then everything kind of fell apart on the last couple days of session because of arguments over the budget, which was extraordinarily contentious this year, and actually a number of bills that I was directly working on also fell casualty to that because they just didn't get to so many things that were on the calendar. And so what that means is that Tesla is not allowed to directly sell cars in Connecticut, although you mentioned that you have one, so you may know this already, but people can go to people can go to White Plains is the closest one, and there's also some
It could
dealerships
be anywhere.
in
I mean, we
Massachusetts.
actually saw our car at a mall in Philadelphia. We went back in after they took us out for a ride and sat us in front of a computer, had us push a few buttons and decide what we wanted. I mean, anybody could do it on their own computer. I mean, that was what was amazing. And then I think it was, so we had put a down payment, whatever the thing was, and then it was actually delivered from Massachusetts, and then it was registered in Connecticut by probably the people that are working for Tesla in White Plains. They came into Connecticut to get the car registered for us.
Oh wow, that's nice.
And it was easy. They brought it down on a truck, dropped it off in my garage. You've got I think it's a freezer plug or a dryer plug. So I get my car charged once every couple of weeks. I remember to plug it in. But it's great. I mean, it was a very easy process. And I understand they're now coming out with a new model that'll be half the price of what we paid. It's, well, not quite, but actually just under what we paid, but about $35,000 to $38,000.
Right, this is going to be their new, more affordable version. So I believe it'll be a sedan, and instead of being quite as flashy as the beautiful Model S, it'll be a more somewhat more modest car that is meant to be accessible to a larger number of consumers. And they're also coming out with an SUV, which is, I think, going to be coming out next year, if I remember correctly.
But this one, my husband says I use it like a truck because it could have the third seat. I mean, it is a remarkable car. But I was so disappointed that, thinking about all the people that I had to go through, all of those jobs that were created, and yet we can't get that here.
Yeah, and there's a similar issue also with the shared solar that we were just talking about, in that a lot of the solar businesses are flocking to New York and Massachusetts, which have this, and they're spurning Connecticut. And a lot of the at the public hearings, there were a number of investors who came and testified, and they said, look, we would love to do business here, but you're not giving us the opportunity. So it's the same type of thing.
It's crazy. You can have a policy that says we need this, and then yet you get the legislators that just say, oh yes, we need this, and let's study it.
Although I will say there are some things that the state is doing on electric vehicles, apart from the Tesla bill, and these are some of the things that I was directly involved in. And Governor Malloy has been quite supportive. First of all, well, actually this was prior to Governor Malloy, but Connecticut is one of the states that has adopted California's cleaner car standards. So that's the Clean Cars Act. And so we've joined together with a number of other states that have these more stringent rules for vehicles, and that includes having a requirement for having more electric vehicles and other what are known as ZEVs, or zero emission vehicles, and that means there are zero tailpipe emissions. And so there was that foundation that Connecticut had already been seen as a state that wanted to encourage these clean vehicles. And Governor Malloy, who I've heard is a car guy, he likes driving, he likes cars, and he's enthusiastic about these clean cars. So he joined a number of these other states, California being the leading one, in something called the Zero Emission Vehicle Memorandum of Understanding and Subsequent Action Plan. And in that, these states basically joined together and said, our goal is to have, oh gosh, what is it? I think I'll have to look back at my notes, but it sets a target for the number of zero emission vehicles on the roads by 2025. And it says these are strategies we can do to get more of these cars on the road. And in Connecticut, what the state's been doing is they developed a program called EV Connecticut, which the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection is administering through their Air Bureau. And they've given out quite a few grants to both businesses and municipalities to install free charging stations. So as they like to say, it's made Connecticut the first range-confident state in the nation. People talk about range anxiety, and that's basically worrying that your car is going to run out of batteries before you can find a place to recharge it. And Connecticut has put in enough charging stations. The goal is to have one within, I think, a 10-minute drive, 10 or 15-minute drive of every place in the state. And they've basically reached that. There
Pretty
still
much.
there still need to be a few others, and they're
Even-
mostly concentrated along I-95 and I-91, and there are somewhat
Only in
fewer
the western part
in
of the
other
state.
areas.
When they
Yeah.
did all of the new upgrades to the other service areas along 95, the charging stations weren't put in. So you've got the Merritt Parkway lacks enough charging stations. So they still
There's
have
definitely a
some-
lot more work to be
Yes.
done, and they
However-
do have some outstanding grants available that
To do that.
they're still
Okay.
handing out. And also, they did initiate a new program this year, which Governor Malloy announced back in May, and this is known as CHEAPER, is the acronym, and it's a rebate program for clean cars. And so you can get up to $3,000 on either the purchase or a lease of a zero-emission vehicle, and that includes both battery electric vehicles, the kind you just you plug in.
Right.
They don't have any gas
engine, no
at all.
maintenance, and, yeah.
And also the plug-in hybrids that mostly are electric, but then they have a smaller gas tank to kick in if you run out of batteries.
Right.
And then the regular Prius plug-in is eligible for a smaller rebate because it has a smaller battery. So that was something that the governor did using money from utility merger funds that had been set aside to use for some type of environmental conservation project.
Okay.
And so he allocated $1 million to do that. And I think as of the last time I checked a week or so ago, the state has handed out around $200,000
Out of the million.
of the million
Well, it's
in
not well
rebates.
publicized. I'm a little surprised that it's not publicized a little bit more. But so how long is that program going to last? Do you know?
The funds are projected to last until around early spring as of right now.
Okay.
And what my group, I've been leading the Connecticut Electric Vehicle Coalition, which includes Connecticut Fund for the Environment and several of our partners, including Acadia Center and Sierra Club and Environment Connecticut, as well as the Connecticut Auto Retailers Association has joined with us because they've been pretty good about selling electric
cars.
Their cars, indeed.
But
and so
I would
that's,
think that they would have recognized that if Tesla came in, I want to go back to California a minute, but if they had allowed Tesla to come in, and their car companies really, they're only now beginning to wake up and say, yes, we should be manufacturing an electric car, then you would have had real competition in the state. But by shutting it off, I think they've hurt their own businesses because, now that their auto manufacturers are coming out with more of the plug-in, they may still be hybrids, but they're basically running on battery. They're going to be
cleaner versions, right?
Right, the cleaner version. But to go back to California, you said they've been leading this, and they've been doing that for a long time. I mean, when California had, when they first set the guidelines up, I can't even remember, it was the early 1990s or something.
Right.
And they said, no, we want, like it was a fantastic number that had to be completely zero emissions, electric cars.
And also fuel cell vehicles. We shouldn't leave those out because they're starting to do their rollout now.
But back then,
then it was electric.
Electric cars. And the people, they never sold the cars. The manufacturers did not sell them. They would only lease them. And they did that so that they could then sue the state of California for an unjust law. And they had the U.S. government join in with them, and that they destroyed the bill in California, and then took back all of these cars that people that had leased them loved and destroyed them. So it's not like we did not have the capacity to be the world leaders in electric vehicles almost 2 decades ago. It was available, we could have done it, but sometimes, I think that this is part of the problem. The corporations that get involved and decide our profits are more important than real value and real technology that creates new sources of jobs. So the economy got hurt, the environment got hurt, and now that it is now no longer a fable that climate change exists. We've continued to do damage to our climate. So I just wanted to make that comment about California because
and I could go on and on about the things California has done since I'm actually from California and take a lot of pride in it being a leading environmental state. And I believe what you were mentioning just now were what people termed compliance cars, where they were basically just directed at filling this mandate.
Right. But they loved them. I mean, it wasn't like they were not a good car. You know, people really did love them, and they went to bat for them. They wanted to buy them. Okay, so my lease will go out, you've got the car, I will buy it. Rather than sell it, they repossessed them and destroyed them.
Yeah, I think the rollout could have happened a lot more quickly than it has, but also the technology has gotten a lot better. So range is getting better and better, and the cars are getting better and better. And so one of the big things that needs to be done is to let consumers know that there are a whole range of zero-emission vehicles that are out there that are suitable for a lot of consumers. I know someone at the Green Bank who just recently got a Leaf and was going on about how great it was.
Yeah.
And you know, people who have them have been big fans of them. I know, someone who has a BMW i3 who just absolutely loves it and is always telling people about how much he loves his car. And people who get them are generally very enthusiastic about it. But the problem is that the larger population isn't really aware that they're out there, what the benefits are. They don't necessarily realize
the price ranges.
Yeah, what the price range is like. They may think of them as kind of a little dinky golf cart and don't realize that they have amazing torque, that they're really fun to drive, that they accelerate quickly, as I'm sure you know, being the owner of a Tesla. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is to do some more public education and outreach. And it's been shown that one of the best ways of getting people to develop interest in electric vehicles is by getting them in the cars and experiencing them firsthand. So back in April, we helped host an event in Stamford where we invited people to come and test drive a whole range of electric vehicles. And people came out there, and it was kind of like a little party, and people got to view the different models and talk to representatives from the auto dealers. They got to go for test drives, and afterwards a lot of people were like, yay, I had never really thought of this as an option before, but maybe when I get a new car, maybe I'll try one of these.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot more of that needs to be done to inform people about the options that are out there.
And it's not just the distance, because like with I know with Tesla, they have their supercharger, so you get charged in like 35 minutes. But you can now drive from the East Coast to the West Coast and not have it cost you a single penny. I mean, that to me is amazing.
It is amazing.
Or up and down the East Coast. You could go from here to Florida, because there have been so many superchargers now that have been installed for that particular car. And as you said,
there are also an increasing number of what are known as DC fast chargers, which can accommodate any type of electric vehicle.
Right.
The Tesla ones are only for Teslas because they're specially designed for them.
But
the other fast chargers can be used with a Volt or a Leaf or whatever.
And with the Tesla as well.
And with the Tesla
because
as well.
they just have all these different plugs that come with their, so if you don't find one of their superchargers, you can use any charger anywhere. And that is also pretty amazing. Now, because I know it was less than 10 years ago when it had maybe only 5-6 years ago, when Tesla was beginning to do their test drive from Florida up the East Coast, or maybe it was Washington up the East Coast.
Was that along I-95?
Yes. Yeah. And he got into Connecticut and realized that, okay, he has to charge somewhere, because after he left, I think it was Fairfield, and he was already down toward Hartford and New Haven, and realized that he's got to charge. The only other charger available was in Norwich. So he drove here and made the New York Times about how he, how he had to stop in Norwich, because we've had the electric charger here for those cars. And you are right, Norwich Public Utilities has tried to be much more progressive on renewable energies. Like I know currently we have 5%, only 5% of the energy is produced here. It's hydroelectric, but they're looking at 2 more hydroelectric. They've got the solar panel units that they want to install, and they've had 2 wind test turbines. One is actually being used by Kelly Middle School. So, I mean, it's not that they haven't been trying, but even once this all comes together, that's still only 25% of the electricity that would be generated here. So I can see some other
yeah, that's one of the reasons that we really need to focus on developing solar, and in particular shared solar, across the state, because under state law we have a renewable portfolio standard, and that requires the state to get 20% of its electricity from what are known as Class 1 renewable sources of energy, which includes things like wind and solar, by 2020.
What about wave powers? Because there was a number of developments several years ago that actually looked at the amount of power that kind of water flow can actually generate. Do you know much about that?
Only a little bit. We spoke about that in my energy and climate law class in law school, and I've heard bits and pieces of news since then, but not a whole lot. My understanding is that it's a pretty new developing technology, and it's really exciting to think about getting power from the motion of waves.
Right.
But right now, I think, you know, it's still...
Or tide. It doesn't even have to be
or from the
just
tide.
from a tide.
Yeah, but I think at this point, they're not expecting that to be a meaningful source of energy for a while yet, because the technology is still kind of emerging. People are working on it. Hopefully they're getting some grants from the government to work on this, because that's something that we need to have more people looking into. But from what I've heard, it's not on the cusp yet.
Okay. Let's move on to some of the other things that have been on the agenda in Hartford. I know that they started working on a new public transportation, their transit expansion. They started holding hearings around, well, we had the hearing in Norwich, looking at the seat buses, and both Ben and I were at that hearing, and listening to the way people described the need for public transportation, it was kind of amazing that it stops at like 5 o'clock at night. So people that need to get to work at 7 because they have a night shift or something have absolutely no transportation. To get from Norwich to New London takes an hour and a half. So that even the kids that want to come up from New London to go to Three Rivers, it's an hour and a half trip to get up here. Mm-hmm. So looking at what some of the problems were, the small definition of certain routes, when you have critical times that the bus should be a direct line without a lot of side stops, so that you can make certain deadlines to expand some of the routes, especially the times. You know, when the buses run, maybe even on weekends would be nice. Right. So they had a lot of discussion at the hearing about that. They talked about the train. I mean, we finally got the Shoreline to come down to New London, but they are looking, why can't you expand it so it gets to Westerly? You know, so that Mystic is included. You know, I mean, would you like to, because I know you've worked on this legislation, didn't you?
I have not. We actually have
okay.
a separate person who works on transportation issues,
okay.
but I know enough about it. I can speak,
okay, good.
Say a few things. So I'm not familiar with the minutiae of the specific routes or timetables or any of that. But what I can say is that it's clear that transit needs to be expanded in the state. It's pretty minimal at this point. You know, there is the train running along the coastline. That's good. There hopefully at some point is going to be this new line from New Haven to Hartford, which has been in the news a lot recently. With there's a lot of acrimony between Amtrak and the state, and funding and time for completion. So hopefully that'll all be resolved, and we'll get that in place. But there's a very clear need to increase transit. Connecticut Fast Track, the new bus service, has been doing well. They've gotten a good number of riders. I think they said they were expecting their 1 millionth rider sometime in September if things continue to,
right.
ridership continues as it has been. So
But the other, when you talk about trains, a lot of times the east of the Connecticut River is totally isolated. We are forgotten. I mean, you do, I mean, it's good for, the work that you do is wonderful, but again, you've got almost all the work is directed west of the river. There's a little bit down here, but it's not where the emphasis ever is. When you look at the trains, again, it took us how long just to extend it from, you know, just to get down to New London. And then now we have to fight just to get it to the rest of the, you know, a little bit more, please. But worse than that, you now talk about the train that's going to go from New Haven to Hartford. But we've got a train route that's going to be coming from, I believe it's down in New London, coming up right past Norwich. It will extend into Willimantic, eventually up to Worcester. It's now a private railroad, but they're not going to stop in Norwich. We have a transportation center there, but we have no train for passengers, so they're not even considering this. And yet, when you look at where the biggest need is, most of the people, yes, it's a convenience. We need public transportation. But I would hope that sometimes people in Hartford, begin to look at where some of the economic need for public transportation exists.
I think that's a big part of it, and I think everyone who's affected by this, which is a large number of people, it's helpful if you can reach out to your representatives and be clear, say, hey, this is an important issue to me, and really, you know,
the problem is
raise awareness about it.
But the problem is all the money in the state is coming from the western part of the state. Yeah. We get, you know, we take on all the responsibility for 2 casinos. We have the burden of, like in Norwich, we have 33 separate languages that are spoken in the home, and then our school system is overwhelmed by having to teach English as that second language, discussing things with parents who do not have English even as a second language yet. So our school system is incredibly burdened. We have housing needs that we need. They're paid what, $10 an hour to raise a family. So we have a real need for affordable housing, and yet all the money that goes from the casinos is divided up. You know, there's a heck of a lot more of the state west of the Connecticut River, and yet it's east of the Connecticut River that takes all the economic burden, while they continue to get additional incomes from what is affecting us directly. And so it's not just having 1 or 2 legislators in Hartford that will begin to advocate for us. It has to be more than just them, because they are shouted out by Fairfield, and it's not that they shouldn't have something. Right. But there's got to be some benefit to this area. When we take on the biggest burden, we have the most people that need public transportation, and yet we're not the ones that ever get spotlighted. I'm hoping that you, as an attorney that has to work with the Connecticut Legislature on some of these issues, maybe goes back with just a little bit of...
Yeah, no, thank you for informing me about that. As I said, I am very new to the state, and so I'm not familiar with all of the geography or anything. But yeah, one thing I can do is talk to the folks who are involved in the Transit for Connecticut Coalition, and I'm not sure what their makeup is like, if they have any representatives from this area.
I would love to have you give me a call about that when you find out.
But yeah, I can look into that and find out, and if there aren't, then maybe we could see about getting some people from this broader region or from Norwich specifically involved in that, and so they can become a more powerful voice.
I know we have a number of other issues that you've also tackled since you came on board less than a year ago, but we have this hour goes by very, very quickly, and you know, you've had a lot to offer us in terms of real information, and I am very grateful you did join us. But like you said, contacting our legislators, our state reps and our state senator, and Kathy Ostin is one of the best state senators I think we've got. So Okay, I want to give you a chance to kind of talk about how can the public, how can our viewers actually get involved with some of these issues, because they're going to affect their life.
Great, thank you. So first, I just wanted to briefly touch on something we didn't get a chance to discuss, and that was the formation of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. This is something that he formed. They just had their first meeting in July, and the next public meeting is coming up in September. And so basically the idea behind this council is to put together strategies to meet the requirement under the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is a state law requiring the state to reduce emissions by 80% from 2001 levels by 2050. And so this is a public meeting. It's coming up in September. In fact, the president of my organization was appointed to this council, so he's serving on that, and I'm helping him out with preparing for it. And so I would encourage people who care about climate change and about the state being proactive about addressing climate change and reducing our emissions to go to the public meeting. They take public comments. People can go and they can speak. You can also submit written testimony. And there was a pretty good number of people who came to the last one, but we can always use more voices, and so that's one thing that I would encourage people to do. You can find information about it on the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection's website. It's known for short as the GC3.
GC3?
It's the Governor's Council on Climate Change. So that's one thing I would encourage people to do. And also, just to give a little bit more information about what I'm doing with Connecticut Fund for the Environment.
Connecticut Fund for the Environment.
That's the name, right. Okay. And we're a nonprofit based in New Haven. We also have a smaller satellite office in New York, in Western New York, okay, that is focused on the sound issues, but most of us are in New Haven. And we are a nonprofit that works on environmental issues throughout the state. We're working to clean up the air, the land, the water, the Long Island Sound. And so we have a very active group of members and what we call activists. And so if you're interested in finding out more information from us or getting involved, the International Coastal Cleanup is coming up next month. That's something that people could participate in. So I'd encourage people to come check out our website. It's ctenvironment.org. And on the website, you can read about the various initiatives that we're involved in. You can sign up to receive action alerts, and that's basically information that is emailed out. You can choose which subjects you're most interested in hearing about. So for example, you could pick energy and climate, or you could pick Long Island Sound, or whatever you most want to learn about.
Bacteria in your beaches.
Exactly, and those have been going out on a weekly basis, as I said earlier. And so you can sign up to get more information, and that'll also tell you when you can help us, because we really need support from citizens doing things like submitting testimony and letting their legislators know that they care about things like shared solar and electric vehicles and so on.
It is easy to get to her site. Again, it's ctenvironment.org. And I really encourage you to go on the website just to learn a little bit more. Shannon, Attorney Laun, thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. And I know we'll kind of keep in touch. You can use me as a resource anytime you want. Again, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, we'll see you next week on Norwich Confidential, and we are hoping, because it's kind of a kickoff for election season, we will be having both of our both the Republican and Democratic town chairmen on the show to discuss the political process. So we'll see you next week. Good night.